At the moment, everything shattered. The lights were blinding, the roar of the crowd deafening. Years of sacrifice, sweat, and unrelenting pursuit had led to this very moment. But in a heartbeat, it all slipped away. A devastating head kick connected, and the world saw a titan crumble. Daniel Cormier hit the canvas, his dream crashing down with him. The referee's voice faded, drowned in the echoes of thousands watching history rewrite itself. Tears welled in his eyes, not from pain, but from the bitter taste of defeat. The camera zoomed in, capturing the rawest moment of his career. Was this the end, or just another chapter in an unrelenting war against destiny? The battle against fate. Daniel Cormier was never meant to be great. He was too small for heavyweight, too late to start MMA, too burdened by the tragedies of his past. But destiny never asked for permission. It pushed him into battle after battle, forcing him to rise from the ashes. The world saw his victories, but they never felt his losses, the ones that cut deeper than any punch. Before the octagon, before the accolades, there was only pain. A childhood molded by hardship, a wrestling career haunted by what-ifs, and a past that never loosened its grip. Every setback told him to quit. But some men aren't built to surrender. Some men fight even when the war seems unwinnable. The world saw a fighter broken inside the cage, but they never saw the battles he had fought long before stepping into it. Before the UFC, before the medals and belts, Daniel Cormier carried wounds that never truly healed. A young boy who lost his father to violence, a rising athlete who lost his daughter to fate's cruel hand, tragedy followed him like a shadow. Most men would have crumbled under the weight, but Cormier, he turned his pain into fuel. Every takedown, every punch, every ounce of sweat was a tribute to the losses he endured. He wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting the ghosts of his past. But grief is a relentless opponent, one that can't be knocked out or outworked. Some nights, it whispered that he wasn't strong enough, that the world had already decided his fate. He had seen his Olympic dreams ripped away, his body betray him at the peak of his career. He had every reason to walk away. And yet, every morning, he laced up his boots, stepped onto the mat, and fought. Not because he had to, but because he refused to let the past define him. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing redemption. For Daniel Cormier, the wrestling mat was more than a battlefield. It was salvation. When life tried to break him, wrestling gave him control. The precision, the grind, the art of imposing his will. It was the only place where pain could be transformed into victory. He became a force, climbing the ranks, silencing every doubter along the way. NCAA finalist, two-time Pan American champion, Olympic wrestler. But destiny, as always, had other plans. In 2004, he stood seconds away from Olympic bronze. A slip, a mistake, 3 points lost, and with them, his dream. But he didn't break. He swore he'd come back stronger. 4 years later, he was ready for redemption. A sharper wrestler, a more disciplined athlete, and a man fueled by unfinished business. But fate had one final cruel twist left. The weight cut for the Beijing Olympics pushed his body beyond its limits. His kidneys failed. His dreams collapsed. The warrior who had survived everything was now sidelined, not by an opponent, but by his own body. The Olympic stage was gone, his wrestling career over. As he sat in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, one question tormented him. What now? Failure could have ended Daniel Cormier's story. Instead, it became the catalyst for something greater. Wrestling had been his salvation. But with his Olympic dreams shattered, he found himself lost. The fire inside him still burned, but it needed a new purpose. That's when fate led him to mixed martial arts. At 31, he was too old, too late. At least, that's what they said. But Cormier had spent his whole life proving people wrong. He stepped into the American Kickboxing Academy, a room filled with killers, and dared to believe he belonged. The transition was brutal. Wrestling had given him control, but MMA was chaos. The punches came harder, the kicks sharper, the pain relentless. Training partners like Cain Velasquez broke him down daily, exposing every weakness. Most men would have crumbled, but Cormier, he adapted, he learned, he became something terrifying. A wrestler who could fight. It wasn't long before his coaches saw what the world would soon witness. This wasn't just a new fighter. This was a future champion in the making. The cage door locked, and the world watched. Was this just another wrestler trying to fight? The answer came within minutes. Cormier didn't just win. He dominated. Takedown after takedown, fists hammering down like thunder, suffocating every opponent in his path. His first victim lasted barely a round. The second, even less. Each fight sent a clear message. This man was a force of nature. Within 2 years, he was undefeated, leaving a trail of destruction behind him. But his greatest test was yet to come. The Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix was a gauntlet of monsters, legends, and battle-hardened warriors. Cormier wasn't even supposed to be there, just an alternate, a last-minute replacement. But fate had its own plans. First, he demolished Antonio Bigfoot Silva, a man who had just crushed the legendary Fedor Emelianenko. Then, he dismantled former UFC champion Josh Barnett, tossing him around like a rag doll. The message was clear now. Daniel Cormier wasn't just winning. He was taking over. Daniel Cormier was now a champion, but his journey was far from over. Winning the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix had cemented his place among the elite, but there was one problem. The ultimate prize wasn't his yet. The UFC heavyweight belt was the true crown, the final test. But claiming it came with a cost. The throne already belonged to his closest friend and training partner, Cain Velasquez. Cormier had fought his entire life to reach the top. But was the dream worth betraying a brother? The answer came quickly. Cormier made a decision few would have the strength to make. He walked away. Rather than challenge Velasquez, he chose a different, even more brutal path. He would cut down to light heavyweight, a division ruled by one man, John Jones. But before he could chase the king, there was one last mission at heavyweight. He needed to prove beyond doubt that he was the best big man not named Cain Velasquez. Enter Frank Mir, a former UFC heavyweight champion. This would be Cormier's first test in the octagon. And failure was not an option. The moment had arrived. Cormier stepped into the UFC cage for the first time, the lights brighter than ever, the pressure heavier than any opponent he had faced. Across from him stood Frank Mir, a battle-hardened veteran with years of experience against the best. If Cormier was truly a contender, this was his chance to prove it. From the opening bell, he didn't just fight, he dominated. He trapped Mir against the cage, suffocating him with relentless pressure. Every attempt to escape was shut down, every second spent in survival mode. 15 minutes later, the judges had no choice. Cormier had arrived. But not everyone was convinced. The fight was methodical, controlled, but it lacked the knockout, the highlight reel finish the fans craved. Dana White called it hugging. The critics questioned whether Cormier had the killer instinct to be a star. He had won, but the whispers of doubt remained. Cormier heard them loud and clear. His response? Another fight at heavyweight, this time against Roy Nelson. He dismantled Nelson with ease, proving once again that no one could match his pace. But heavyweight was never his true destination. The weight cut would begin. He would shrink his body, endure suffering, and step into a division ruled by one of the most feared champions in MMA history, Jon Jones. Daniel Cormier had fought giants at heavyweight, but now he was stepping into an even deadlier battlefield. The light heavyweight division belonged to one man, Jon Bones Jones. The undefeated champion, the prodigy, the fighter many called the greatest of all time. But Cormier didn't care about legacies. He had one mission: drag Jones into deep waters and break him. But before he could claim his shot, there was one final obstacle: the weight cut. At heavyweight, he had power, endurance, and freedom. Now he had to shed 40 pounds to make the 205-pound limit. It wasn't just dieting, it was suffering. His body begged for mercy, but his mind was already made up. No turning back. When he stepped in for his light heavyweight debut, the world saw a different Cormier, leaner, meaner, and just as relentless. His first test at light heavyweight? Patrick Cummins, a man who had once trained with Cormier and claimed he had made him cry in wrestling practice. That was a mistake. The fight lasted 79 seconds. Cormier charged like a wrecking ball, smashing through Cummins with ruthless precision. Message sent. The division had been put on notice, but Cormier wasn't here for scraps. He wanted the throne. His next victim was Dan Henderson, a legend in the sport. Many believed Henderson's knockout power could test him, but the fight was a massacre. Cormier ragdolled Henderson, tossing him around like a child before locking in a rear-naked choke. As Henderson tapped, the world knew the Jon Jones fight was inevitable. The undefeated challenger was coming for the king, and the war was about to begin. The moment Daniel Cormier entered the light heavyweight division, the storm began brewing, and at the center of that storm, Jon Jones. The reigning champion, the undefeated phenom, the man who had dismantled legends with ease. But Cormier wasn't just another challenger. He was a force with a vendetta. This wasn't about rankings or belts. This was personal. Their feud didn't begin inside the octagon. It started in 2010, in a quiet hallway, when a young, cocky Jon Jones smirked and said, "I bet I could take you down." For an Olympic wrestler like Cormier, that was an insult he would never forget. The bad blood intensified with every interview, every face-off, every insult exchanged. Jones mocked Cormier's height, his age, his credentials. Cormier fired back, calling Jones a fraud, a paper champion, a man who had never faced true adversity. The tension boiled over at a UFC press event, where they came face to face. Jones pressed his forehead against Cormier's. Big mistake. Cormier shoved him back, and chaos erupted. Fists flew, cameras crashed, security scrambled. The fight had already begun. Months before, they would step inside the cage, and the world was watching, waiting, knowing one thing for certain. This was going to be war. The UFC wasted no time. The fight was booked. Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier. The undefeated champion versus the relentless challenger. But this wasn't just about a title. This was about pride, about proving who was truly the best. The trash talk escalated to dangerous levels. Jones laughed at Cormier's wrestling. Cormier vowed to make him suffer. The world was split. Was Jones too skilled, too untouchable? Or was Cormier the one man who could finally break him? But as fight night approached, fate intervened. Jones suffered an injury and was forced to pull out. The fight was postponed, but the rivalry only grew more vicious. The delay gave Cormier more time, more fuel for his fire, more hunger to take what Jones held. When the fight was finally rescheduled, the stakes were higher than ever. A legacy was on the line. Cormier wasn't just fighting for a belt, he was fighting for redemption, for every loss he had endured, for every moment fate had tried to break him. The world was about to witness a battle that would be remembered forever. The anticipation was suffocating. The UFC had built this fight into one of the most heated rivalries in history. Daniel Cormier, the undefeated challenger, against Jon Jones, the undisputed king. Every press conference was venomous. Every interview dripped with hatred. But behind the scenes, Cormier was suffering. The weight cut had drained him. The mind games had exhausted him. And deep down, he knew. If he lost this fight, his entire legacy could crumble before it was even built. Fight night arrived. As Cormier walked to the octagon, the roar of the crowd faded. This was it. The first round began, and the two warriors clashed. Cormier pressing forward, Jones countering with precision. It was a war of wills, a chess match of violence. But as the rounds wore on, something became clear. Jones was winning. He took Cormier down, outstruck him, outmaneuvered him at every turn. By the time the final bell rang, Cormier already knew. His dream had just been stolen. The judges announced the decision. Unanimous. Jones was still the champion. The undefeated streak, the momentum, the destiny, all shattered. Cormier stood in the octagon, his eyes filled with emotion, trying to process what had just happened. He had given everything, pushed harder than ever before, and still, it wasn't enough. Was Jon Jones truly unbeatable? Had Cormier reached his ceiling? The doubt crept in like a slow poison. But champions are not defined by their losses. They are defined by how they rise. Cormier could have faded away, could have accepted that he would never be the best. Instead, he made a decision. If I can't take the belt from Jon Jones, I will take everything else. He turned his pain into purpose, setting his sights on the rest of the light heavyweight division. If Jones was the king, then Cormier would become the executioner. He wouldn't stop until there was no one left standing. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Losing to Jon Jones could have broken Daniel Cormier. Instead, it ignited something terrifying. If he couldn't have the champion, he would become the executioner. The rest of the light heavyweight division, they were now his prey. His first target, Anthony "Rumble" Johnson, the most feared knockout artist in the UFC. A single punch from Rumble had sent men into oblivion. But when they met inside the octagon, Cormier refused to be hunted. The fight started like a nightmare. Boom! A right hand from Rumble detonated against Cormier's skull, sending him reeling. For a brief moment, the world thought it was over. But then, something unbelievable happened. Cormier smiled. He absorbed Rumble's best shot and marched forward like a man possessed. The tides turned. Cormier dragged Rumble into deep waters, drowning him with suffocating pressure. Then, in the third round, he locked in a rear naked choke. Rumble tapped. Daniel Cormier was the new UFC light heavyweight champion. The throne was his. But the king he truly wanted to dethrone was still out there. Cormier had the belt. He had beaten Rumble. He had crushed Alexander Gustafsson in a 5-round war. He was defending his title like a true champion. But no matter how many victories he racked up, no matter how dominant he was, there was always one name that haunted him: Jon Jones. The world refused to forget. Every win came with an asterisk. Every interview came with the same question. But can you beat Jon? Cormier tried to silence the critics, tried to build his own reign, but deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't the true king. Not yet. Jones had been stripped of his title due to outside-the-cage scandals, but he was still undefeated. He had never been beaten. And the world wanted to see one thing: the rematch. Cormier vs. Jones 2 was inevitable. There was no escaping it. The only question was, would history repeat itself? The rematch was set. Cormier vs. Jones 2. Redemption. Legacy. The chance to erase the nightmare of their first fight. Cormier was no longer the challenger. He was the champion now, stronger, sharper, and more relentless than ever. But Jon Jones? He was still the ghost that wouldn't die. After suspensions, controversies, and scandals, Jones remained the dark force looming over Cormier's reign. The build-up was venomous. Insults, threats, personal attacks. Cormier refused to call Jones the real champion. Jones laughed and called Cormier a fake king. But there was no more talking. The cage would decide everything. The tension in the T-Mobile arena was suffocating. Cormier walked out with the belt wrapped around his waist, but he knew it wasn't truly his until he defeated Jones. The first round was a war. Cormier pressured forward, forcing Jones into dirty boxing exchanges, landing shots, proving that he was not the same man Jones had beaten before. The second round was razor close. Every move was calculated, a deadly chess match between two of the best to ever do it. But then, the third round came. Jones took a step back, set his feet, and threw the one weapon Cormier never saw coming: a left head kick. It landed clean, and the world stood still. Cormier staggered, his legs betraying him, the world spinning around him. Jones, the predator he was, pounced like a lion sensing weakness. A brutal flurry followed: knees, punches, elbows. Cormier collapsed, unable to defend himself. The referee rushed in, stopping the fight. It was over. The arena erupted, the echoes of Cormier's screams lost in the chaos. Jones stood over him, arms raised, victorious once again. History had repeated itself. The belt that had once been Cormier's was now wrapped around the waist of the one man he could never defeat. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, had been torn away in an instant. Had he been chasing an impossible dream all along? Tears welled in Cormier's eyes as he struggled to process the loss. The crowd cheered for Jones, but the cameras captured something else: Cormier's heartbreak. In the post-fight interview, he tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "I trained so hard for this," he whispered, the weight of 2 defeats crushing him. Was this how his story ended? As the man who could never beat Jon Jones? The whispers began. Was Cormier truly great, or was he just a champion in Jones's absence? The pain of that question was worse than the head kick itself. But deep inside, a fire still burned. If he couldn't be the best at light heavyweight, then there was only one place left to go: back to where he belonged. Defeat could have been the end. It should have been. Twice John Jones had shattered Daniel Cormier's dreams, and now the whispers were turning into roars. He was never the real champion. He could never beat John. The loss haunted him, but then something happened. Fate intervened. Jones, his greatest rival, was stripped of the title once again. Due to another scandal, the belt was vacant, and the UFC, knowing there was only one man worthy, gave Cormier a choice: reclaim what was taken. But was he truly ready to wear the crown again? Knowing the shadow of Jones still loomed over him, Cormier stepped into the octagon against Volkan Oezdemir, a vicious knockout artist who had made a name for himself by putting opponents to sleep in seconds. Many believed Cormier was too broken, too mentally shattered to withstand another war. But Cormier wasn't there to survive. He was there to remind the world who he was. From the opening bell, he took control, suffocating Oezdemir, dragging him into the deep end and finishing him in the second round. The referee pulled him off, and just like that, Daniel Cormier was once again the UFC light heavyweight champion. The belt was his, but something inside him whispered, this wasn't enough. There was still one more mountain to climb. Light heavyweight had been his battlefield, but it was never truly his kingdom. The shadow of John Jones had tainted it, poisoned it, made every victory feel hollow. If Cormier was ever going to silence the doubters, he had to do the impossible. He had to move back to the division where he once ruled, but this time he wasn't just fighting anyone. He was going after the most dangerous man in MMA, Stipe Miocic, the reigning UFC heavyweight champion, the man who had defended the belt more times than any heavyweight in history. The greatest heavyweight of all time. Cormier had spent years at heavyweight, but this was different. He was no longer a challenger. He was a legend now, with everything to lose. The critics said he was too small, too slow, too old. But Cormier had heard it all before. This wasn't about size. This wasn't about power. This was about destiny. If he could win, he wouldn't just be a two-division champion. He would become one of the greatest fighters of all time. And so, on that fateful night, he stepped into the cage one more time. Not to prove something to the world, but to prove something to himself. The night that changed everything. The octagon door closed. Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic. The greatest heavyweight champion against the relentless underdog who had never truly fit the mold. The air was thick with tension. The world doubted Cormier. Too small, too slow, too outmatched. But what they forgot was that Cormier had spent his entire life proving people wrong. The bell rang, and Stipe came forward, his boxing sharp, his size imposing. He was the natural heavyweight, and he fought like it. But Cormier had a plan. The first few exchanges were tense. Stipe landed clean shots, but Cormier didn't back down. Instead, he stood in the pocket, absorbing the power, analyzing every movement. And then, in the clinch, he found his opening, a short, brutal right hand. Crack. Miocic's body stiffened, his legs buckled, and the heavyweight champion collapsed to the canvas. The referee rushed in, waving it off. It was over. In a single moment, Daniel Cormier had done the impossible. He was now the UFC heavyweight champion. He had conquered both divisions. He had defied every expectation. He wasn't just a champion anymore. He was one of the greatest fighters in history. But just as he had reached the top, the whispers returned. There was still unfinished business. Epilogue. the ghost that wouldn't die. Cormier stood in the center of the octagon, two belts draped over his shoulders. A double champion, a legend. But before he could celebrate, the questions started. What about Jon Jones? Even at the highest peak, his greatest rival still loomed over him. Jones was gone from the sport, for now. But Cormier knew better than to believe it was over. And so, he made a choice. He wouldn't wait for Jones. He would write his own ending. First, he defended his title against Derek Lewis, dominating him with ease. The victory was satisfying, but something still felt incomplete. Cormier had climbed the mountain, but he had one last fight left. Stipe Miocic wanted his revenge. And in the heavyweight division, there are no guarantees. Miocic was not just coming to reclaim his title, he was coming to end Cormier's story once and for all. The rematch was set. One final war. Would Cormier walk away as the greatest, or would his reign end in heartbreak? The final chapter. The night of the rematch had arrived. Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic 2. Everything. Cormier had already cemented his legacy, but legends don't just want greatness, they want dominance. He wanted to retire on top, to silence every doubt, to prove that the heavyweight throne belonged to him. The first round started, and Cormier looked untouchable. He picked Miocic apart with crisp strikes, controlled the pace, and outclassed the former champion. It was happening. He was going to defend his title, retire as the greatest heavyweight ever. But then, Miocic made an adjustment, and everything changed. The fourth round began, and Cormier still looked sharp, but Stipe, the relentless warrior that he was, had found a weakness. Body shots. He started ripping vicious left hooks to Cormier's liver over and over, like a man chipping away at a fortress. Crack. The pain shot through Cormier's body, slowing him down. Another shot, then another. The champion was crumbling. Miocic saw his opening, swarmed him with punches, and suddenly, Cormier was on the mat. The referee stepped in. It was over. The belt, the reign, the dream. All gone. Cormier sat in the octagon, the same look in his eyes as the night he lost to Jon Jones. Was this it? Was this how his story ended? He could barely see, his eye damaged from an accidental poke, his body battered, his legacy on the line. Reporters asked about his future. Would he fight again? Would he chase redemption? But deep down, he already knew the answer. Some battles aren't meant to be fought forever. He had nothing left to prove. He had been an Olympian, a double champion, one of the greatest to ever do it. And so, Daniel Cormier walked away from the sport, not as a man who had lost, but as a legend who had given everything. The world of MMA would never forget his name. The king had fallen, but his legacy would stand forever.